Welcome to On the Couch with Clare, the podcast where we are discussing relationships, life, health, and today we are discussing a bit of a cross-section between mental health and culture with Dr Anthony Dillon. Very proud to say he's a friend of mine and a colleague, a psychologist and an Indigenous academic and commentator. His research interests are positive psychology, the conceptualisation of mental health, wellbeing and Aboriginal education. He's a regular contributor to public conversation around mental health and Indigenous affairs, and he's not afraid to take issue with the current popular ideologies which portray Indigenous people merely as victims of white Australia and history. So I'm thrilled to be able to welcome him to the podcast. Anthony, thank you for making time.
Thank you.
So you and I are both psychologists, and that's how we've kind of intersected and most recently, been speaking. And I haven't actually asked you this question before, so I would like to know, how did you get into psychology and what drew you to human behaviour? Is it something in your background? And what was your aims in going into this field?
Look, I think it was very quickly as a teenage young man, I had some troubles, conflict, and an auntie of mine said, look, why don't you go have a chat with this distant family friend? He's a psychologist. I said, no, I don't need that. And she nagged me. So I thought, this older guy, a real old guy, probably in his 40s at the time.
That's really old, Anthony. Thanks.
I was 17. He's not going to be able to tell me anything. But I pleased my auntie. I went there, and within about 5 or 10 minutes, he just showed that he understood where I was coming from and just gave me some very practical tips for being able to literally turn the situation around, just realising that, you come into conflict with someone, you don't have to be upset. You can allow them to say what they want to say, but you can still have your own peace of mind. And so that was a turning point. And that just, got me interested, and I was reading books and on the topic. And then I got to an age where I thought, I really should do something about this formally so that I could help be a psychologist in an official capacity.
That's amazing. I mean, just someone giving you a different perspective.
Yeah, and I was pig-headed at the time. I was like, this guy won't be able to tell me anything. And when I saw how I was able to turn around, I thought, I'd like to be able to help other people like that as well.
You've spoken a little bit about your background. Your father was very well known as the first Indigenous police officer in Australia. And you've spoken about, I know, to me about your background being, a good childhood and a good start to life. Did you grow up with a strong sense of your Indigenous heritage?
Equally, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Perhaps more English because that's the environment that I was living in. So I never lived in a remote community or anything like that. But I had a big, loving Indigenous family on my father's side, so it was hard to escape that. Not that I would want to. It was just, the best childhood. I had two great families, the English and the
your
Aboriginal.
Mother was English?
Yes. Yeah, two great families.
And did you see any of your extended family cousins as different from each other? Or it
No,
was just,
definitely not. We're just all blood.
Exactly. Yeah. So race wasn't prominent. Your Indigenous culture as well as your English culture may be prominent, but the idea of race wasn't prominent.
No.
Yeah.
And one wasn't above the other, certainly. It was just, I was Anthony, and at home I was taught the rules for living, and those rules were also consistent among the families as well.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk to you about mental health at the moment, and this isn't a race issue by any means. This is a human issue, and we know at the moment that, there's lots of information out there about the deterioration of mental health with Australians and particularly young Australians, and the rise that I see with diagnoses anecdotally in my clinic, but we know, statistics tell us that the diagnoses generally are on the rise. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, huge uptake in PTSD diagnoses, certainly autism spectrum disorder, things like that. So I want to talk to you about we've spoken in the past about your attitudes and what you think about the advantages and disadvantages of telling someone that they have anxiety, that they have depression. It's this kind of thing that a condition that they have. What benefit or not does that do to someone?
Well, my first thought is it's not a benefit, just like I would not say to someone, you have anger. I would say you are angry. Which is anger, like anxiety and depression are very normal human states. And, they serve a purpose sometimes, but generally we try and keep them to a minimum. So I think if we can remind people that you're normal if you have these and do these. I just said have then, slip of the tongue there, but, if you are depressed,
you're feeling
angry,
anxious.
Yeah, and that's normal. And, of course, there can be very severe depths of that. Someone could be extremely anxious, and so they certainly need help. But I think there's the possibility of, well, not possibilities, I think it happens when you give it a label and it becomes I have such and such. That label and that diagnostic label, which is different to diagnoses in medicine, where in psychiatry it's more of a descriptive label. And that's not necessarily evil, because it can be useful for clinicians to communicate with one another. And also we know if a person has the label X, here are some treatments you can offer, and here's what you might expect from a person with condition X. But having condition X doesn't explain why they have those behaviours. It's a bit like saying he's depressed because he has depression is very circular. So you have that aspect that it doesn't explain. It has a use for summarising behaviours and that sort of thing. And so we just need to be careful of not putting too much emphasis on the label, because people then think, that explains my behaviour. When in actual fact, there's other explanations for their behaviour, which if they focused on those, they would be able to address that behaviour. And also some of these diagnostic labels are seen as, in people's minds, they're permanent.
Yes.
It's just permanent. I have condition X, that's it, I have it for life.
Well, they sound like it, particularly with the term disorder at the end of it, right? Anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. It's like a doctor telling you, this is a permanent condition. And I think it's a good point to say that doesn't explain the causes of that condition. And I think that, psychiatry moved away, 1980s, from looking at kind of a causal background to these things to more of a checklist.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you fulfill in a symptom checklist X amount of symptoms of you're tired, lethargic, and you've withdrawn, and you're feeling sad, and therefore you come out with depression. But it's not telling you, there could be other explanations there as well.
There has to be other explanations.
Yes.
Because that checklist is not an explanation.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think the term disorder is at least better than illness. I'd much rather say it's, they have such and such disorder rather than such and such illness.
Because?
Well, illness sort of certainly implies underlying pathology.
Yes. And it strips an individual from feeling like they have agency and power to change their situation.
So when the term illness is used, I would say, okay, that's, illness as in the metaphorical sense of the word. So if I say that joke was sick, obviously a joke can't get sick, or the economy is sick. The term sick is used in a metaphorical sense.
Yes. And so it's a fine line, because I think we were in the 1990s hitting some type of sweet spot, if you like, whereby the stigma of mental health was starting to be reduced in terms of coming forward. And us as psychologists, we're not – this is what we do. We don't want a stigma of struggling with your mental health, and we want people to be able to come forward. But we don't want to normalise the condition itself, because who wants to live in a world where, it's normal to be depressed, or it's normal to have anxiety?
Well, it seems some people do want that. It can become a badge of honour sometimes.
Yes.
And let me just qualify, I am in no way downplaying the seriousness
That's right.
of people's states and conditions.
But that particularly hits in teenage years, the population I work with, because it's just they're completely ripe for feeling that, and social media and so forth, that they found their community, that this is an explanation for why you're feeling like this. And it's very hard to challenge that, because they don't want that label taken off them.
No, and look, I generally don't challenge except on few occasions. The moment's got to be right. I just figure sometimes the challenge will just create more resistance, which you don't want. So I say, okay, well, let's talk about those behaviours. What is this condition you have, what is it preventing you from doing? What goals can you not achieve? And let's talk about that.
And just like that psychologist that you saw at 17 then, that sounds very action-based and practical.
Absolutely, yeah.
Rather than dwelling in the label.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The other concept that comes up so much these days, both in mental health and wider discussions, is this idea of victim mentality. And I've spoken to a couple of people on this podcast about it. And I think that absolutely feeds into declining mental health because it again robs people of being able to change their situation. Does that align with what you see in your clinical work with clients?
Yes. I mean, it's not every person, but you do certainly see it from more than what I would like to see it, that the victim status is a very powerful one. The victim is freed of responsibility. They can shut down a conversation. And, of course, I'm seeing it not only in the mental health arena, I also see it in the Indigenous affairs arena where I also have a foot in that as well. So,
yeah. And I think sometimes when we make accommodations for people that we think either because of their race, I mean, this goes across so many things, either because of their race, or I see children who have some mental health difficulties or learning difficulties. And suddenly what we do is we lower our expectations for them and we say, oh, well, we're not going to expect little Johnny to achieve at a certain level. And I think we do that with race as well. And I think that feeds into that victim status. And I don't think that that's fair on people, that we shouldn't have and hold them up to account to what they can be in their life. And I know you've spoken about that from an Indigenous point of view, that we need to show people through mentorship and so forth.
Exactly. And also, again, to protect myself, certainly there are genuine victims out there.
Yes.
No question about it. But this, quasi-victim status, if you can call it that, we have to be careful not to reinforce it. And just on this topic, I'm very inspired when I see. You can hop onto YouTube and you can see lots of different examples, but one that comes to mind very quickly is the young Aussie man, Nick Vujicic, born without any arms or legs, leading a fantastic life. And I encourage people to get his book, Life Without Limits, which was a decade ago written, but the very conversational style. And, if anyone has a right to complain, it's someone like him, but he's leading a very good, productive life. And I certainly learned a lot of good psychology from his book, and he's a non-psychologist.
And it's amazing. You see these people that have been through such adversity and yet somehow they manage to come out and thrive and succeed more than the average person. What makes their brain different? What is their perspective that makes it
I don't know if it's their brain that's different. It's certainly the content of knowledge and the attitude they have. And, to see plenty of examples, we only have to look at our parents and grandparents and that who, in many ways had it worse off than what we have. And certainly life was a lot better than as well, I guess. But, there was they have these qualities of, this should not be an excuse. I'm going to do my best anyway. And sometimes I will fail, but I'll do my best anyway.
Yeah. What do you think needs to be a focus that we've lost a bit, particularly with mental health and just general well-being?
Yeah.
What have we lost in those previous generations that we can start adding back in now?
Easy answer, not easy to fix it. And I wrote about this in my article in the Australian a couple of months ago. And so many people talk about this. Dr. Rick Hansen talks about that need to get back around the campfire, where people who raised children together are sitting together, talking about things. And Hugh Mackay talks about it beautifully, Australian psychologist Hugh Mackay. I've read several of his books, but the latest one I'm reading, The Way We Are, where he just talks about— It's a great book. Yeah. He just talks about, it needs to start in the family. It needs to start in the neighbourhood, getting back to connecting with each other. And look, the genie's out of the bottle. We're not going to, and as you said, we're not going to give up our smartphones and that's here to stay. But as individuals, we've got to look for more opportunities to connect with your neighbour, to connect with your family, all that sort of thing. And, And particularly with kids, when you have kids connecting with each other, the mums and dads end up connecting with each other. And that's why I love seeing weekend sport. And, obviously it's good for the kids' fitness and all that sort of thing, but there's a social dynamic happening here and we need more of that. So just getting to know your neighbours. And, I say this, some people take it as a joke, but I just look at my train station where I live and no longer do you have a person there who sells tickets. Everything's modernised. And I just thought for some of the commuters, that interaction with the salesperson may have been the only meaningful interaction they had, or it could have been the best one they had. Just g'day, good to see you. But now you've got your Opal cards and all that sort of thing. So,
well, you've got your headphones on and you're looking at your phone and you're literally just in your own world. So we're not going to let go of modernity, that's for sure. But as individuals, we've got to look for ways, the upstream approaches. We'll always need, crisis centres and that sort of thing. But how as individuals we can start making contact, not just texting, but catching up, getting together, doing a face-to-face thing like this when we can. And, if we were to do it over Skype, I could have done it. But with the option of coming in face-to-face, there's a bit of interaction. And I've just met with some people behind the scenes. G'day, how are you? That sort of thing just increases the connections. And, in psychology, there's a lot of disagreements, but one thing most mental health workers agree on is the importance of connection, people connecting. Maybe that's why we love coffee, because we love chatting to the barista.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? It's that ritual and they know you and they know your order and you're saying good morning and, it's that's why we still will spend the money we do on a takeaway coffee rather than make it ourselves. Yes. Yeah. So social connection and community, which I think previous generations did much better. And I even one generation ago, I mean, I grew up in Sydney, but it was not uncommon as a primary school age child to be in someone's house down the street. And at some point, my mother would wander down and people would pop in and out of each other's homes and she'd figure out which home the kids were in at that point. But then the adults would sit down and have a drink and then, invariably it was just that very ad hoc Saturday afternoon thing. Spontaneous. Yeah. Yes.
And look, the other thing I should add to this too is certainly there's a place for mental health professionals, no question about that. But if we have more connections, one, it prevents a lot of problems. And two, if you're in a good network, if you have a problem, and there was a time you would chat to trusted friends, so, sometimes older, whoever, and you could talk about problems. These days, the same sorts of problems that were spoken about amongst friends a generation ago, you go to a therapist.
Or you go to Google.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Is that sense of community something that Indigenous cultures historically have done better?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's not unique to them, but, many cultures, it was that campfire mentality. And, we've certainly evolved because there was certainly in all cultures, there were some bad aspects and we've got rid of that. But we've kind of lost the really good stuff where it was, there's a lot of tough love there. And particularly in Indigenous communities, the roles were very well defined. Adults started at a young age, by the way, knew what they had to do. And if they didn't do it, there were consequences. And so they learnt, often the hard way, but they learnt very quickly. And also the other thing too is the loss of, I was going to say fables, but a friend of mine said he doesn't like that term, mythology, storytelling. And it's good that, the messages, timeless messages that are in those mythology. So, for example, in my therapy, both in group and single therapy, I talk about the story about the Indian grandfather and his Indian grandson. And the grandfather says, son, inside of you there's two wolves, a good wolf and a bad wolf. The good wolf is love, peace, hope. The bad wolf is selfishness, anger, ego. They're fighting. And the little boy says, which one wins? And the grandfather said, the one you feed. So those sorts of stories, it's good to bring those back too.
Those stories will stick with someone through their life to pass on.
In nearly every session today, I still say to people, particularly people that having problems with addictions, I'll say in life it's so much better to be the tortoise than the hare. So, that sort of embracing the old stories.
Yes. And I think this sense of passing down stories and also family histories, we're losing that a bit, mostly because we're losing another campfire setting, which is the dinner table. I mean, these are discussions that happen at the dinner table.
Yeah.
And I also like the idea in that sense of raising children with communities and connection, that they have other elders or other adults that they can go to talk to.
Absolutely.
Outside of mum and dad. You reach a stage where you might go to an auntie or you might go to a family friend who's been around, who knows you.
And some cultures have that saying, it takes a tribe to raise a kid.
Yes. And we're losing that. So in terms of moving forward, it's, as you said, it's hard to know where to start. How do we do that? Because I think no one would disagree with this. But I think it starts with an individual, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Know thy neighbour.
Exactly. And, as you, Mackay, said, we're not going to be letting go of our smartphones anytime soon. So maybe, in your household, you can have a rule. Once a week, we are all at the dinner table together, once a week. And we do not have phones, for 1 hour. That's a little thing. So doing things like that could be enough to, just break the cycle or hold it back to a degree.
I want to move to have a little bit of a chat also about an issue that I see in Australia and other countries, but Australia at the moment, and that is we're often described now by people as a divided nation, and that occurs down the lines of race, but it also occurs on, I think, many topics. People seem polarised, but they also seem pretty incapable of tolerating another viewpoint, just to let that be different, and that we're all, very broad ideas, and that's a good thing. But in this day and age, I kind of fear that it's not viewed as a good thing. If you're on the other team, well, that's it, you're on the other team and, we can't be friends type of thing.
This is identity politics. Yeah.
When did that happen? Because I don't remember growing up with that. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s. But
certainly the barriers were more permeable.
Yes.
I guess.
I don't think my parents even voted the same, but that was fine. Married couples didn't, and that's fine. I mean, these days it's very tribal.
Yeah. And look, I guess one of the things is I wouldn't call it an advantage, but one of the attractive features for some people with identity politics, even though they wouldn't call it identity politics, they would just say, I'm being right, I'm doing the right thing, is when you associate with a group, if you build your sense of self-worth on that group membership, that is not a good thing. Because when you do build your sense of self-worth on that group membership, anyone who disagrees or attacks it, you get very, very defensive. And we gave an example just before, I won't mention the name, but someone who had a very opposing view to me on a recent event issue. We were still very good friends, very respectful, because neither one of us had built their sense of self-worth on belonging to a certain camp, and we allowed each other to have different views.
Well, you hadn't built your whole identity on that one particular issue. Just as I'm sure, Anthony, you haven't built your whole identity on being, an Indigenous person. You're also many other things.
Oh, yeah. I never ever introduced myself as Anthony, the proud Kumba Merry man or whatever. I'm just Anthony.
Right.
Am I proud of that ancestry? Absolutely. As proud as what I am of my mother's English ancestry. And, I'm also proud of being a Queenslander. But if Queensland lose the Origin match, I don't feel bad. If there's a bad news story about Queensland, I don't feel bad. I think, I'm still a Queenslander, but it's not a reflection of my value as a person.
Yes, but it's once one element of someone's identity is put up above any others.
Yeah.
And of course I'm referring to race, but, seemingly it's put up above any other.
Absolutely. And I talk about this when I give lectures around town, which I used to do a little while ago. When I'd give a talk on Aboriginal psychology, I would explain, I was born in the 60s. I was born in Queensland. I'm male. I'm heterosexual. I have Aboriginal ancestry. I have English ancestry. None of those things by themselves define who I am. I'm a mix of all those things. And if I elevate any one of those above the other, then I'm treading into dangerous territory, in my opinion.
Mm. Last year, you were vocal about the Voice to Parliament and the referendum that we had. Regardless of people's opinions on that, I found it in some ways confronting and shocking, and some ways interesting as looking at human behaviour from a psychological point of view, and the seemingly intolerance and anger and that we had to go through last year for that. I don't think that I certainly do not know any Australians that would not vote for something that made meaningful change in a positive way to people's lives. I haven't met someone yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as you were giving that intro, what you just said, I was formulating that as it was going to be my intro in response.
I stole your line. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I don't know anyone who doesn't want to help Aboriginal people either. So I think what happened, and this is what you're getting to, what happened with the Voice?
Yeah, because I think as a concept put out there whenever it was, when the government came in and said they would do it, I think there was a surge of, okay, well, let us consider this, tell us the details and how it's going to work. And I think in many ways there was some buoyed optimism to say, well, at least someone's putting something on the table here and there's an idea. Let us have a listen to it.
Yep.
And then suddenly over that period of time, well, not suddenly, gradually over a 6-month period, the mood shifted significantly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering why that happened.
I think because, as we were just saying, everyone we know wants to help Aboriginal people. So when they first heard about this prospect of the Voice, and it got framed as Aboriginal people do not have a voice, which they do, but a lot of people bought into that. And they thought, well, yeah, I want to help Aboriginal people. Of course I will vote yes. So it was, unquestionably done with good intention. But then I think as time went on and more information came out and there were more discussions, a large percentage of those who were initially in the yes camp started to question, well, actually, will this put food on the table? Will it get Aboriginal kids into school? Will it help them? No, I don't think so. And there was also another factor too. I think people were starting to feel a bit of pressure from corporates and celebrities and all that sort of thing, that this is the way to go. And so their autonomy, which is ownership over the decision, was being stripped away from them. And as humans, we do not like our autonomy being taken from us. It's a fundamental human need to have autonomy, ownership, endorsement over the things we do. So I think that's what happened. It started out with, all people wanted to help Aboriginal people. And then some started to realise, I do want to help Aboriginal people, but I'm not convinced this voice thing will do it. And I often said throughout the debate, if someone could show to me how it will, if they could join the dots, well, then I would seriously consider voting yes, but no one was able to join the dots for me.
And increasingly, I think people's eyes were open to the fact that in this march or this bid towards unity and reconciliation, which we all want, which are noble goals to have, the proposals put forward, like the Voice and other things, seem to be, in my mind, weirdly going back to a apartheid separatist state, literally at the moment with dividing up land and so forth, where in some weird converse way, we're saying, well, in order to get unity and reconciliation and to help Indigenous Australians, we're going to give them their own section of Parliament and their own, areas in many bureaucratic
and all that does
elements.
It just promotes the us-them mentality, and that's never helpful.
Well, I mean, we're sitting here in the middle of Sydney, and behind you there is the Harbour Bridge. And I'm not sure what you think about this. It's maybe a bit of a controversial statement. I don't like looking at the top of our icon and seeing two flags. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't be happy to come under the Aboriginal flag. It's actually not about which flag, but it's about a feeling that I think we're the only country in the world who literally flies both. And when I look at that, the Harbour Bridge, for me it says, well, that's their flag and that's our flag. And I think that's an awful symbolism for the state of the country at the moment. But anyhow, I'm wondering whether you can bring that back to us as clinicians and mental health. And what I'm increasingly faced with as a psychologist is our regulatory bodies emphasising that if you are non-Indigenous like myself, we need cultural training and we need specific training before I can treat an Indigenous Australian.
Yeah, well, in my practice, I treat the individuals as I see them, and I certainly cannot. I do have a significant portion of Indigenous clients, and I cannot see any difference. I cannot see any difference in the way I treat them to how I treat my non-Indigenous clients. So I don't go through any sort of cultural navigation.
Well,
myself.
do I need to do that if I have a Greek patient or an Italian patient or a?
And look, I was looking through you'd call it a handbook, I guess, on Indigenous mental health. I won't name the author, but it's considered one of the big milestone books on Indigenous mental health. And there's one section it gives advice on how to, as a clinician, how to treat Indigenous clients. And it's got, be respectful, be authentic, be honest, establish a good relationship. And I show this to uni students when I lecture to them. And I say, what do you notice about that list? And they go, that's exactly how you treat all clients.
Anyone?
Anyone, yeah. So, if you treat the client with respect and, sometimes there may be some cultural differences and, we can usually cater to those sorts of things. But far too often when there is this cultural training, you can be sure it's very exaggerated, it's very romanticised, and about the skills and knowledge and that you get taught about in these cultural training things, which makes a bit of money for the person giving the training. Probably about 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 Indigenous people would fit that criteria in my opinion. It's like saying, got to be careful with Indigenous people, you shouldn't make eye contact, blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, that's ones like that are just so far and few between. Again, if you're authentic and you're just being yourself, and we know what it's like when we meet other people here in Sydney that are from very different cultures. They could be visiting or something, and we interact with them. We like it. We make allowances. We understand that there's going to be some differences, and we get on.
Well, it's also almost presumptuous that I have to be able to have experienced the same experiences as my client. I mean, that's just absurd. I'm not going to be in that position. I mean, if someone is having, some anxiety after an event they've witnessed, do I have to have witnessed that event to be able to relate to them or so forth? Or
do I have to have been an alcoholic in order to help someone with an addiction? Yeah, no, absolutely not.
And like you said, I mean, that could come across conversely quite offensive if I've done all my cultural training and I've come in here as a white woman and I've sat down and thought, right, well, I know that I shouldn't be looking at you and I know I should be, talking about certain kind of Indigenous practices to you. And this person looks at me thinking, I'm just here for my condition at the moment and this isn't relevant at all. And actually, this is quite patronising.
And look, coming back to that, I don't want to talk about this too much, but if we take it to its logical end, what happens when you have an Indigenous, non-Indigenous union? They produce children who identify as Indigenous. Are you going to say that non-Indigenous parent needs training in how to look after his or her own children? What absolute, am I allowed to say bullshit in this?
Absolutely.
What absolute BS.
It's a very good point.
For that sort of thing. So, look, a good clinician is someone who genuinely cares about people. They recognise that the commonalities far outweigh the differences. And if there is a misunderstanding due to a cultural quirk or whatever, they get around it quite easily. They just, this is what I mean when I say that or whatever.
Well, I just ask my clients to explain it. Yeah.
So long as people can sense that the person's authentic and they care, it overcomes most barriers.
To finish off, Anthony, is this a message that you could give, particularly young people, but that's the population I work with, who are feeling disenfranchised and feeling down, I suppose, for want of a better word, about the state of this country, and that, governments aren't doing enough when it comes to inequalities and race and so forth. And they're very angry young people I see, and they're very disconnected with the ability to have pride at being an Australian.
Yeah. Well, look, it's easy to, a couple of things. A lot of Australians share the concern that, yes, we could always be doing better, but I think it's important to remind young people and old people too that it's a really hard job for any government to run a country this size where we've got 26 million people or whatever it is. And, there's a significant portion of those people who are a bit, they're doing more leaning than lifting. So it's really hard for government to carry us all. We can just do our bit and realise, okay, around the world, Australia's a pretty good place to be in. It's not perfect, but we can walk out of here. We're not going to be bombed. Most of us know where our next meal is coming from. Some don't, of course, and we should be helping them. They're the true victims. But it's a pretty good country, and we should be striving for improvement. And one thing I would say to young people, and perhaps one of the biggest problems I see in my clinical practice, what holds people back the most is they engage in short-term beliefs or behaviours which give a bit of a lift in the moment, but in the long run do not help. And it's so easy to say, this is a terrible country. Oh, this government sucks. That feels good in the moment. You just felt, God, I'm so clever. But in the long run, you've kind of undermined your own integrity. So I would say, look for ways to improve, but don't be too tough on the government. Ask yourself, what can you do to make it a better country? Offer advice where advice is needed, and give praise where praise is needed. And I know that's the one you want to finish on, but there's one other thing I want to add. Because one of the questions we had discussed was the future of psychology or something like that. And I would say the profession and also research institutions need to be more transparent in their research and that sort of thing. So, for example, I see that a little while ago the Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatry were challenged by their own members of, hey, we got to take down from our website this BS that these medications correct chemical imbalances. We don't have the proof for that yet. And so they took it down. So in universities, in psychology courses, rather than just calling it critical psychology, it should just be called this is what we do in psychology anyway. We should learn about the limitations of experiments. We should learn about the biases. We should learn about the placebo effects and all that sort of thing. So just be more open, more transparent about what are the limitations of psychology. And let's focus more on that which we have rock solid evidence for, which could be refuted tomorrow. But, there's enough stuff that's happening now which we know the science just ain't there to back it up. And we should not be afraid to tackle and refute that even more.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes people push back on what we do know as rock solid evidence because it does seem a little bit simplistic. But it works. And when I'm working with clients, sometimes it's as simplistic as get outside to some green space each day, get some sleep, those things. And they
get up 20 minutes earlier.
Yes.
Go for a walk. Absolutely. And, I think this is a bold claim, but I think just about everything I do in my clinical practice does not take an advanced degree. It's a return to old-fashioned values, connections, common sense. Treat others the way you'd like to be treated. Let's be honest. Let's have some integrity. Let's go the extra mile. Let's help someone who's in need of trouble. Let's not try and always show people up. Again, to quote Hugh Mackay, and one thing I like about Hugh, he talks about psychology. He's a psychologist, but he talks about from a sociological perspective. He said we need to start thinking in terms of how are we doing, not how am I doing. So just having that attitude, and that would be my message for young people and old people, just start to think, how are we doing instead of how am I doing?
The collective and the community. Excellent.
Yeah.
Dr. Anthony Dillon, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you so much for giving up your valuable time and joining me today on the couch. If today's conversation spoke to you, consider sharing the love and send it to someone you know who needs to hear it. Don't forget you can watch this full episode on my YouTube channel. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button. It helps us to be able to deliver bigger and better content to you absolutely free of charge. If you've got comments or questions about today's episode, head on over and come hang out on Instagram, where you can follow and contact me. Okay, stay curious, stay connected, and join me next time on the couch. Take care. Okay, for those who've made it this far, just remember, even though I am actually a registered and qualified psychologist, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered professional individual advice.